Well, let's get started here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this event on where we're going, essentially, with the Iran nuclear deal. Is it going to be revived? Is it not going to be revived? What's on the table? What can we expect? And what are the consequences of reviving a deal or not reviving a deal? Before we get right into it, let me just introduce myself. I'm Paolo von Schirach. I serve as a president of the Global Policy Institute, an independent think tank associated with Bay Atlantic University. For those of you who don't know us, we're located in downtown Washington, D.C., very close to the White House, for whatever is worth, and where I serve at Bay Atlantic University as a chair of political science, of the Political Science and International Relations program. With us today, we're really fortunate to have two great experts on this subject matter. Barbara Slavin, I will not recite her long and distinguished CV. You have all that information that was sent to you with a flyer that all of you have received. So, and her long and distinguished career as a commentator, as an analyst, as a writer, and particularly in this on this very subject. And our good friend Mark Meirowitz, known, I'm sure, personally to many of you, students of BAU, who's part of our family, of a professor who's been with us for many years, and also as serving as a fellow for the Global Policy Institute. So our objective today is to try to shed some light on this somewhat complicated topic. And I will turn it directly to you, Barbara, to give us your sense of where are we now on this. Give us a sense of what's going on, and keeping in mind what happened before, even in the not so distant past during the Trump administration, and then we reverted, to something different with Biden. So where are we? And by the way, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all again. We are in limbo, I think, and have been for several weeks. There were negotiations which began about a year ago in Vienna on reviving the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. They made good progress, and then they paused in June for Iran to have presidential elections. Then there was a long pause while the new government got itself organized and named a new negotiating team. They started up again in November of last year. And a 20-page document draft has been written. It covers all of the nuclear steps that Iran would need to take to roll back the rather significant advances that it's made in its nuclear program over the last couple of years since President Trump withdrew from the agreement unilaterally. But there are a couple of other issues still on the table, and there were some last-minute complications. The Russians tried to squeeze more sanctions relief out of the deal than they were entitled to, perhaps to compensate for the sanctions that have been placed on Russia over its brutal invasion of Ukraine. That faded, but the momentum seemed to sort of drop. And everyone left town, they left Vienna, they've not gone back. There have been some envoys that have gone back and forth from the European Union. Enrique Mora, who is in charge of the sort of day-to-day, has gone to Tehran, he's come to Washington. So proposals are still being exchanged, but there appear to be a couple of stumbling blocks. One of them is over one of many designations of the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is an organization that's part of the Iranian military, but it's been sanctioned numerous times by the United States because parts of it, elements of it, have been involved in activities that we disapprove of. There's a designation that was put on in 2019 under the State Department, Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, an FTO. And the Iranians have been asking that this be removed. They say it's insulting. How can you designate such an important part of their military establishment as terrorist? They reject that label entirely and say that it's not based on fact. We can argue about this a little bit if you want. But this has emerged as an issue. The Biden administration has been reluctant to reverse the designation. There may be a couple of other issues involving sanctions relief and sequencing of the deal that are still up in the air. I think my concern is that the longer this limbo goes on, the more both sides begin to, how should we put it, lose their taste for the agreement. There's a lot of concern on the Iranian side that if a future president is Republican, that they would just see, as Yogi Berra used to say, deja vu all over again, that a Republican president would quit the deal yet again. So Iran would have what, maximum 2-3 years of sanctions relief. Is it worth it? A lot of Iranians are asking. And on the US side, there's concern that the longer this goes on, the less advantageous it is perhaps to return to the agreement because some of the provisions in it will begin to lose force. Now, I still argue it's worth it because the main and most important element of this deal is that it prevents Iran from having enough fissile material for a single nuclear weapon until January of 2031. And without that material, Iran cannot build nuclear weapons. And I think all these other issues are distractions and red herrings. The deal was never supposed to resolve all of the problems that the United States and others in the international community have with Iran. It was supposed to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon in a verifiable manner. And it still does that. Another factor, and I think the Iranians recognize this, but the longer this goes on, the more they lose the benefit of going back into the oil market in a big way and selling oil at a very high price. The price will come down and they will have lost an opportunity to sell a lot of oil at a good price. They also need to reclaim frozen assets, some $100 billion in prior oil revenues that are frozen in foreign banks. So I think it's still advantageous for Iran, it's advantageous for the United States and the international community. But as I say, the longer this goes on, the more you have the naysayers on both sides raising objections, and the more domestic politics obviously comes into play, and that is not a good thing.
Ask you a quick thing, which again, for the uninitiated, for the people who are not as well versed or not as closely as well versed in this matter that you are, there's some kind of oddity out there that Iran officially never said, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, that they wanted to pursue a nuclear weapon, right? They've always said officially.
They deny it. Yeah, they deny it.
That this is all for peaceful, this is research, this is for, for electricity generation, this is all about peaceful use, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, when Mr. Trump, yanked this thing off and said, no deal anymore, this is extremely bad deal, it doesn't provide all the guarantees that we need, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Iranians, as we know, jacked up their program and started enriching uranium, right? I'm not versed in all the technical issues of the centrifuges and all that stuff. But so, how this from a public relations standpoint, if nothing else, looks really rather odd. We seem to be engaged in this complicated effort to prevent Iran, as you explained to us, for getting that amount of fissile material that eventually will allow them to develop, a nuclear weapon that can be put on the warhead of a missile. And yet the Iranians always say, no, this is not our intent at all. Is that just how things are? This is just noise, or is that relevant? I'm just asking you because you've been following this matters for years.
Yeah. Well, I always say that Iran has the slowest moving proliferation program in the history of nuclear weapons because the Iranian program was started by the United States in the 1950s. And the Shah of Iran had ambitions in this regard. Of course, he was overthrown in 1979. Anyway, in the time that Iran has, had a program, Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea have all developed nuclear weapons, and Iran has not. So I think there are a couple factors. First, after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the Western countries that had helped Iran with its program, the United States, Germany, France, all pulled out. And Iran dropped the program. It started it up again during the Iran-Iraq War when the Iraqis were sending missiles onto Iranian cities, and there was concern that Iraq was developing nuclear weapons. But it had a very slow progression. And a lot of what Iran did, particularly in the 90s, late 90s, was research, in effect. They had a research program into building a nuclear weapon, as well as developing a civilian nuclear capacity. They wanted power plants, nuclear power plants, so they could sell their oil and get their energy in another way. But the United States was opposed. There was always efforts by the United States to prevent the Russians and the Chinese from helping the Iranians. And it was very, very, very slow progression. In 2002, though, there was a discovery, was announced by an Iranian opposition group, but it was actually probably discovered by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad, that Iran, in fact, had made substantial progress, was already building plants with centrifuges, which are the machines that spin the uranium to enrich it. And there was a kind of crisis over this, that Iran, oh dear, might be trying to get a nuclear weapon. This began a long process of diplomacy, as well as economic sanctions that eventually led in 2015 to this agreement whereby sanctions were relieved and Iran rolled back the program. So the Iranians always say they were never interested, et cetera, but look, this knowledge is dual use. The same way that you make the material for fuel for a civilian power plant is the same way you make the material if you're going to build a weapon. And we know that they have weapons plans. We know they have scientists who are perfectly capable of doing this. Many of these scientists were trained in the United States at places like MIT. So I think it's wise, given Iran's other activities in the region, to do whatever we can to make it harder for Iran to develop nuclear weapons, because that would be very destabilizing. It would set off an arms race, a nuclear arms race in the region with the Saudis, Emiratis, and others perhaps trying to get nuclear weapons as well. And with everything that's going on in that part of the world, as well as in Europe now, I think it's the last thing we need.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Mark, let me turn to you, and again, warm welcome to you as well, my friend. Give us a sense of, based on your observations, let's imagine a different scenario now. Barbara gave us a great history now of how we got basically to this point, which is still rather, dubious whether there will be an agreement or not. And as she pointed out, there would be still value in delaying any nuclear program up to 2031, you said, right? Correct?
Yeah.
And so there's value. We're in 2022, so it's 10 years. But give us a sense, Mark, based on your reading, what happens if all this goes nowhere, there is no revived deal, and indeed Iran does develop a nuclear weapon? Give us this scenario, if you care. Iran does develop a nuclear weapon, and what does it mean, not just for the United States, obviously, for the region? Barbara just alluded now at triggering kind of an arms race. Saudi Arabia, maybe if Iran gets it, Saudi Arabia wants its own, and maybe other, who knows, Egypt. We know Israel has a no declared policy, but we kind of all know that they have a nuclear arsenal. How big? I guess it's anybody's guess, but as a kind of a weapon of last resort, perhaps. So give us a sense, based on your understanding of the region and what's going on. What happens? Is this like really the end of the world if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, or just like in the case of India and Pakistan, we learned that we can live with it somehow?
Thank you very much, Paolo. And what a pleasure to be with Barbara, who has spoken many times to my classes and who I've respected for many years. And she is one of the preeminent experts on this. However, Before I answer your question, I think I need to look at the analysis of the history and the facts in terms of understanding this. So the problem with this deal is that it was flawed from the outset. And I just want to very briefly explain that.
I have, sorry, Mark, to interrupt. There's a little bit, from my end at least.
This will be better. This will be better now. You'll hear me better now. You hear me better now,
Yeah,
right?
because it was
Yeah, yeah.
the
No,
voice
no, it's
goes up and down.
it's my laptop. I know I have this with the students. Okay, so basically this deal was flawed from the outset. And in order to understand the world that you want to describe with no deal, I think we have to understand the implications of what would it mean to have a deal, because we did have a deal, and President Trump, as you said, yanked us out of the deal. So what were the problems? In order to forecast how the world develops, I think we have to understand what we're dealing with. And the problem is as follows. The original deal was deficient in a number of areas. Now, for example, President Reagan used this idea, trust but verify. The question is, I don't even think there's a trust factor here because of the following factors. Number one, the Iranians never clarified their past nuclear efforts nor their current nuclear efforts. Secondly, what we call possible military dimensions, the Iranians said you cannot come on our military facilities. And most importantly, besides the sunset provisions that you spoke about where the deal ends, is the verification. The verification program that was sought at the time was anytime, anywhere, and the Iranians rejected that. Now, there was a discussion here previously about the approval, the deal that the Iranians want to be sure that the next president can't quit the deal. That's part of the future scenario. They want a guarantee. Hold on one second. But the problem is there was a law that was passed called INARA, the Iran Nuclear Review Act. And the way this was done was sort of like a right of first refusal. And the Congress didn't refuse it because of filibusters. And the question is, many Democrats have gone and been upset, including Republicans, about the prospect of entering into this deal. So the point is the future that you described, Paolo, is going to be constructed based on the kind of deal that we make here. So should we make a deal like was done in 2015, and by the way, we're in 2022, and it's not the world of 2015, which does not take into consideration the other factors. I know there was a mention about the IRGC, and it's very, very important to speak about that. The Iranians want the IRGC to be taken off the terror list where they were placed by Trump. No less an expert than Jason Rezaian, who writes for the Washington Post, who was himself detained and arrested by the Iranians, called the IRGC an insidious presence, which has weakened Iranian civil society. And he does, by the way, does not agree with the IRGC being on the terror list, but he's very, very worried about other components in Iranian society not being dealt with in an appropriate fashion. So in other words, if you want to be myopic and say, okay, let's do an Iranian nuclear deal again, and let's not think about all those other things. And I would say, and we didn't really, we mentioned this tangentially, the world we live in now after Ukraine and Afghanistan is a very different world than the world we had in 2015. And I'm tremendously, tremendously worried about the future that is going to exist with the sunsetting, without the verification, with all the things that exist in this so-called deal, when we know, because we know from the Israelis that the Iranians continue to develop a nuclear program throughout the time that they said they weren't. And is their threat to their neighbors a real threat? So in other words, to me, the way the Biden administration is thinking about this and why Biden made this a campaign point and why this is very important for Biden now to make a deal is because he's had a number of really very serious. Afghanistan was a huge foreign policy reversal, and Ukraine is just an albatross in American foreign policy. How is this going to end? How are we going to deal with Putin? This is the big issue. So what he does, and he also wants the Iranian energy. He needs the oil. He needs the flowing of the oil. He wants the sanctions to be relieved so he can relieve the European pressure, of course. This is very short-sighted, but this is the reality of where we are right now. We're in a very fraught situation because the world is in complete crisis. So Biden would like to have a victory, a win on making a deal and signing a deal. Understood. But the question is, what kind of deal? Do you trust a regime that states that it's going to destroy Israel off the map, that supports the Houthis? Yes, the Houthis were removed from the list, but they're still involved in these activities. The IRGC clearly has been involved in these activities, malevolent activities, the ballistic missiles, all the other things. So if you want to live in a world where you don't have you blinders on and you want to do a deal compliance for compliance, I'm sure eventually we could do a deal. We can sign a deal with the Iranians and remove the sanctions. One thing I want to mention just en passant, which Jason Rezaian mentions, which doesn't ever get mentioned. He says there's more than $1.5 billion in unpaid damages against Iran in American courts for hostage takings that Iranians, not just the hostages in '79, but other hostages. And the question, I mean, I've always asked is, why would you not make that part of the deal, that those payments would be made and then the sanctions would, then the sanctions would be lifted? Or how about this question? How about making it conditional or doing it installment plan? You get to do something good and then we remove some sanctions. You do more nice things and you stop doing bad things and we remove some more sanctions. But the United States approach is not. Last point, and this is very important. What is it about the United States of America, a country I greatly respect and a major world power, that we have to sit in a separate room somewhere and we cannot sit directly with the Iranians on the negotiation table because they won't sit with us? I mean, even the Vietnam War, we had a table. We had negotiations with all sorts of actors throughout history, but Iran won't sit with us. And we agree that we should sit in a separate room. And guess who brings us the tidings of the deal? China and Russia. I mean, I honestly find that, if not, I find it embarrassing to the United States. I don't understand why President Biden stands for it. Anyway, those are my few points. As far as the world that goes on.
We certainly got a different point of view here, Barbara.
Could I get a word in edgewise? Because there's a lot there.
Yes,
that
please, fire away.
I will. Let me go down through these points. Mark, I love you, but you got some strange ideas.
Okay.
Look, the program is under the JCPOA, was under the 17 facilities, nuclear facilities of Iran, inspected on a 24/7, 365 days a year by the International Atomic Energy Organization. And the problem actually is that we have less visibility into the program now than we did under the JCPOA because Iran has reduced the ability of the IAEA to inspect the program, and that is a serious concern. You're talking about the fact that they never clarified their past activities. Well, one reason is that they don't want to admit that they had a program that was researching weapons. So you have a choice. Do you want to embarrass the Iranians, force them to admit what they did in the past, or do you want to control the program now and in the future? To me, that's an easy choice. You talk about the IRGC. They would remain under numerous sanctions under different authorities, not the State Department, but the Treasury Department. There would be no chance that any American or Western company would ever have anything to do with the IRGC. Individuals in the organization would remain sanctioned. And the part of the IRGC which is of concern, something called the Quds Force, the Jerusalem Force, this is the special branch that operates overseas, would remain a foreign terrorist organization. The IRGC itself is a large group, mostly made up of draftees who have no choice about what military branch they join when they're drafted. So, I think this is, again, it's a red herring. We talked about verification. You talked about trust. It's not a matter of trust. Nobody trusts Iran. That's why we have the IAEA doing verification. That's why we need the JCPOA back. You talked about the indirect talks. That is a problem. But the reason the Iranians won't sit in the same room with us is because Trump walked out of the deal when they were in compliance with it. And we are no longer members. We are no longer parties to the agreement under the way it was defined. The Chinese and Russians are not delivering messages. It's the Europeans, and it's primarily Enrique Mora of the European Union. So I don't find it humiliating to have Europeans be a go-between. When you talked about terrorism claims against Iran, some of these have to do with the IRGC, some of these have to do with things that were done by Hamas or other organizations. Iran did not contest these cases in court. It rejects these claims, and I don't think the United States has any right to hold an agreement hostage to these claims. You know, frankly, the Iranians have claims against us for the damage that was done to their economy by the US withdrawal from the deal and the restoration of sanctions and additional sanctions that were put on by Donald Trump. You also failed to mention the fact that the United States assassinated the leader of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq in 2020, something for which the United States has never really properly accounted. Trump said that there were new plots that were planned. He presented zero evidence. I think it was an illegal assassination under international law, and the Iranians obviously are furious about the fact that this man was killed. He was a hero to them, even if he wasn't to many people in the region. The Israelis have also continued attacking Iranian facilities and individuals, assassinated the father of the Iranian nuclear program, have continued to kill members of the IRGC in Syria. So this is not a one-way street. We may not like what Iran is doing in the region, we may not like the influence it has in the region, but it's not as though the West or the United States has been sitting on its hands in terms of acting against Iran and against Iranian personnel and facilities. Bottom line, are we better off with or without restraints on Iran's nuclear program? Verifiable restraints on Iranian's nuclear program. If we don't go back into the deal, Iran will continue to amass more and more enriched uranium, enriched to higher and higher levels. It will be closer and closer to the capability to build a nuclear weapon. And I don't think that makes us or anybody else safer in the region. So it's a decision. It's not, you know, you don't get perfect choices. The deal in 2015 was not perfect. It's certainly not perfect now, but the question is, are we better off with the situation we're in now and escalating tensions on a number of fronts, not just the nuclear front with Iran, or with a deal that gives Iran some incentive not only to roll back its nuclear program, but also to de-escalate other tensions in the region. And so to me, it's a no-brainer.
On this point, Barbara, and then I'll go back to Mark. Let me ask you this. At the time, please correct me if I'm wrong again, when the Obama administration and with Secretary Kerry negotiated the initial deal, there was this kind of narrative included that even though overall Iranian behavior in the region was not regulated or in any way, part of the deal at all, that there was some kind of a hope, not a certainty, but a legitimate hope that by showing goodwill and showing the fact that we strike a deal, remove the sanctions, give Iran back money that was frozen in the US. I remember the airplane with the bags of cash and all. I mean, everybody, some people remember that. Anyway, and that by showing that we were willing to do all this, that this would show the Iranians that there is a better way forward in dealing with the international community, not just with the United States, but with other countries in the region, and that this would sort of soften their positions and that Iranians would stop being, a revolutionary power that wants to export its own revolution and modify the geopolitical balances in the region. And the argument of the Trump administration was, you see, none of that happened. We had the deal, we gave them the money back, we lifted the sanctions, and they've invested all that money to do more mischief in the region, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure you're extremely familiar with the speech given by Secretary Pompeo, right? Was it at the Heritage Foundation when he listed, all the do's and don'ts for Iran to be readmitted in the family of nations. So, I mean, did that have any point at all, or is just throwing in extraneous stuff? And also, I would argue, please, I would like to know your opinion, that by withdrawing from the deal, I am not sure that the United States did anything to delay the Iranian nuclear program during the Trump administration. So these 2 points, Barbara, but also for you, Mark, was the Obama administration sort of starry-eyed, dreamy, thinking, oh, we're going to reform the Iranians and make them nice people, and so we will all sit together and do, behave like normal people do, having business and contracts and investments and whatnot? And also, what did the Trump administration accomplish by withdrawing from the deal? Those 2 questions. Barbara.
Okay, I didn't realize that you wanted me to go again. There was a hope, there was a hope that we could build on the agreement, but look what happened. Only 9 months after it went into full implementation in 2016, Trump was elected. And so the air went out of the balloon. Trump had campaigned on a promise to quit the deal. And let's be clear here, Trump never read it. He didn't know what was in it. He just knew that Obama did it, so that means it was bad. And also the people, his funders, people like Sheldon Adelson, people like Christian right-wingers were telling him it's a bad deal because Bibi Netanyahu didn't like it. And so he had already decided he was going to leave, and he kept trying to leave. It took him a couple of years, but the die was cast and the momentum was gone. It is interesting, actually, if you look at the situation in the region, it was calmer when Obama was president and when the JCPOA was being negotiated and was reached. Things got much worse under Trump. So to your second point, Trump's withdrawal from the deal accelerated, and the murder of Soleimani and so on, accelerated the program. We're in a far worse situation now than we were 4 years ago. And Donald Trump is completely to blame for that.
Mark, I'm sure you have a different view on this. So your question, my first question again is if we reject what's on the table right now, the Biden administration says, you know what, this is not worth it, let's not do it, it's better to have no deal. Are we better off with no deal and an unconstrained Iran that can do pretty much whatever it wants because there is no deal? Is your take that by withdrawing from the deal, President Trump improved regional and global security or not? That's a question.
Because I don't think it's the choice one way or the other. Let me just say this, we talk a lot about Trump pulling out of the deal, but no less a expert on this is Senator Menendez, who is a Democrat and a chairman in the Senate, has said the following about now.
And an opponent of the agreement.
He opposes the agreement. That's right. That's right. That's what I was going to say. He says that he is very worried about the idea, and this is the premise that you say it's an either or it's not a zero-sum game. It's not either we make the deal and Iran doesn't make a nuclear weapon. We make a deal and they still make a nuclear weapon. I can tell you why that might be, if I may. First of all, you talked about the verification. The way first of all, the IAEA has complained about Iran's verification. In fact, recently about certain nuclear seals that were not used. But if you look at the deal itself, if there is a concern about a possible violation, the IAEA, the time period Iran is involved, it takes about 24 days. I'm oversimplifying it, but it's a whole process where Iran can comment and the group can comment back. And in the meantime, that's a problem. The idea, the way it should have been done was anytime, anywhere. So your premise, Paolo, that if we make a deal, then Iran won't go to nuclear, the whole way to really look at this is that Iran wants to make the deal so that they can go nuclear down the road. Maybe they're not going to go nuclear down the road right now, but they have a trajectory to be able to do it. So the question really is about Trump, and you mentioned Secretary Pompeo's speech. I think it is well worth reading it. I reread it because it's important. For example, is Iran in Syria? Why is Iran around the world supporting Venezuela and other?
All right, Mark, I still have a problem with your audio.
I'm sorry.
Your voice.
So the question is, Iran, if the Pompeo speech is worth rereading, because it gives you some of the warning signs of what this deal might be. So my point really is, if you're relying on compliance program, assuming you believe that this deal would secure a non-nuclear Iran, I believe that is a false premise, because the whole point is that the deal facilitates the nuclearization of Iran. It doesn't prevent it. Maybe it prevents it in the meantime, but the verification program is so flawed that in the meantime, it should be anytime, anywhere. An inspection of military facilities. My point is very clear. Making a good deal with Iran was always a good objective. But what you have now is a plan and a policy that doesn't get you the desired result in 2022. Maybe the world in 2015 looked different to President Obama. Senator Menendez, by the way, is a leading Democrat. He's not a Trump Republican. And he and many of the Democrats oppose this deal because they are worried about what Iran will do. Last point. You know, it's very interesting that the philosophy of dealing with Iran on nuclear deal is completely different than how we negotiate with anybody else. We're always fearful that, gee, Iran is going to make a nuclear weapon unless we make a deal with them. I mean, what kind of a way is that to negotiate with somebody? Trump's point was, we have a sanctions regime, it's working, bring Iran to the table, work out a deal, and remove the sanctions in a practical way in a negotiation. That is not the game plan of Iran. Iran wants the removal of sanctions because they've been hurt by it. And they're not going to make commitments that need to be made, not just on the nuclear program, but on the rest of these issues. So is the idea of the world, Paolo, that you are thinking about, the future world, is that a world in which we have a temporary regulatory scheme that's very flawed, but Iran continues to foster terror, as you mentioned, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, and so forth? How is that in any way compatible with American foreign policy and the idea to have stability in the region? The region isn't going to be stable. And that, to me, should be the ultimate objective. And the Iran nuclear deal doesn't get you there. On the contrary, it gets you to a trajectory of further global destabilization, regional destabilization. And that's what I'm worried about.
All right, got you. We got you. Barbara, back to
Thank
you.
you.
And
Yeah, look,
I know there is a little bit of gap here, but that's why these conversations are interesting and illuminating. But again, I'm sorry, at the cost of being boring, what I'm curious is to say, okay, the deal was, the point is, and it's been said many times, and Mark reminded us, the deal is flawed, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do enough of that, the verification process is too cumbersome, it gives too much notice to the Iranians, certain facilities, we don't really know if they can be inspected or not, all those things. And by the way, their misbehavior continues, et cetera, et cetera. So there comes Trump, and he says, bad deal. We exit the deal, and we are going to exercise maximum pressure on the Iranians via the worst sanctions in the history of mankind, and that will force them to negotiate a better deal. How did that go? That's what I'm asking. In other words, if the deal was bad, did the policy of the Trump administration produce better results as Trump was in office? That's my question to you, Barbara.
No, everything got worse. Everything backfired. Let me ask Mark, would you rather have a crisis next year or in 2031? I mean, would you rather get cancer now or 20 years from now? It's again, it's a no-brainer. What trajectory, schmadrectory? Iran can build a nuclear weapon if it wants to. The whole point of this deal was to give them concrete incentives not to. And you say anytime, anywhere inspections, you only get that if you've defeated a country in a war. And we have not had a full-fledged war with Iran, thank God. You can't just march around in a sovereign country and say, we want to go here, we want to go there, especially a country like Iran, which has been sabotaged and attacked by the Israelis and the United States with cyber worms, that's seen its nuclear scientists, something like 6 or 7 of them, assassinated. You can't just allow people to wander in and out. So, I mean, there's a procedure, and there were facilities set up, remote cameras, all kinds of stuff that we are now not able to get access to because Trump, in his infinite wisdom, walked out of this agreement. So my question to you is, would you rather get cancer today or 20 years from now?
All right, listen, thank you for that. No, but let me ask you something else, which again, I suppose for those who know a lot about this is kind of a given. But for the uninitiated, for the many people who perhaps don't know much about all this, we start from the assumption that since the Khomeini revolution, right, and the ousting of the Shah, who left, if I'm not mistaken, on January 16, 1979, he had cancer. We really didn't know all those things at the time, and never to return. That Iran is bad news. It's really a bad story of a theocratic revolutionary power aimed at establishing its own brand of Islam, not just at home, but in the region and the world, according to doctrine. And that this is destabilizing, this is dangerous, and this has caused so much grief, not just to Israel, that is considered essentially, the Zionist entity that shouldn't exist, but also other, causing troubles elsewhere. Is that premise correct? I'm asking, because that much depends on it. One thing is Switzerland having nuclear weapons, right? And another thing is North Korea having nuclear weapons, right? I think we all agree. If a responsible democracy where sane people are in power has nuclear weapons is one thing. If a crazy leader who can do crazy, unpredictable stuff, or group of leaders gets nuclear weapons, is a different proposition. So I'm asking, I know this may be considered obvious by many, but is Iran really such a major systemic existential threat to the region and to the world, so that if you add to the mischief that they carry out on a daily basis, you add nuclear weapons to it, then you can say, with nuclear weapons, they can deter other countries and keep doing all the bad stuff that they do on a daily basis, and threaten with nuclear retaliation if anybody, gets upset. Is this premise still valid? First of all, is it valid? Can it change? Is this kind of an unmovable thing after, 40 years? How long has it been going on? Since 1979? Yes, it's a long revolution. From Khomeini to all the current law. So I'm sorry, not to digress too much, but Barbara, to you, and also you, Mark, is Iran really this entrenched enemy that ultimately cannot be modified in terms of its outlook and behavior, or can we see something else? Barbara, to you first.
Well, one can always be hopeful. Look, I think that one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in now is because we violated the JCPOA and so destroyed any basis for trust, and we vindicated the anti-American views of the current supreme leader of the country, Ayatollah Khamenei. I don't think there's any chance for rapprochement between the United States and Iran while he's alive. But he's 82, and there will be a change in leadership at some point. And I think that another argument in favor of getting this deal back is that it might stabilize the relationship between the US and Iran so that there is a chance for some sort of change. As Mark pointed out, the world is in a rather chaotic state right now. Certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even though Iran has not criticized Russia openly, Iranians have been appalled, as have many people around the world, by the brutality of the Russians. And this policy of the system to so-called look east, to look to Russia and China as reliable partners, could be undergoing some reconsideration. Certainly it's a matter for debate now among intellectuals in Tehran. So I think we need to restore some kind of stability, some sort of foundation, and then we can hope. I think whole idea of maximum pressure was crazy, because when you put sanctions on a country, particularly at a time when the United States was at fault, frankly, not Iran, all you get is another Cuba. I mean, do we want another Cuba or North Korea where we just sanction forever? That entrenches the most hardline elements. It entrenches the dictatorship. It gives a small elite the most access to hard currency. It impoverishes the general public and leaves them less able to support change and reform. And that is exactly what we've seen, frankly, since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. The current president of the country and those around him are very anti-American. The people who were discredited were those who were more inclined to want a relationship with the West and who originally negotiated the JCPOA. So this policy of pressure and sanctions, particularly when it's largely unilateral, as it is in this case, because the rest of the world did not accept the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, is very counterproductive. Hopefully there will be a change. I know that most Iranians are much more oriented toward the West than they are toward authoritarian states, but we need to give them some ammunition, which means we need to relieve the economic pressure on them.
Thank you for that. By the way, I'm looking here at some questions from our audience. And
could I just answer the last point, Paolo, that you had asked for me as well, just to respond before we do that?
Yeah, okay, quickly, yes,
okay.
Thank you.
First of all, very quickly, how about this? Obama was wrong to enter into the deal. Trump was wrong to pull out of the deal, and Biden is wrong to go back into the deal. They're all wrong, okay? But here is my question about this. First of all, you talk about mutual assured destruction and nuclear policy, right? You know, I would argue that with what happened with Russia and Russia ramping up its nuclear preparedness, scaring the world, there are a lot of big questions now, whether it works. But I think we understand that, and I'm going to use the word irrational, but you know, there was the idea always in the Cold War that the US and the Soviet Union would work together to make sure we wouldn't have a cataclysmic world event. But in the case of Iran, I just don't know that that's a proper premise, because this is a nation that has said its leadership that they want to wipe Israel off the map. And, you know, with all due respect, you talk about Israel sending cyber worms and doing all that. Now, may I ask, if you're Israel and someone threatens to destroy you, and in fact is supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, which are movements which are committed to destroy you, and your Iranian elements are in Syria committed to destroy Israel, okay? So therefore, you need to do something about it. And here's an interesting point. We didn't really talk about this, but I think this is an important point. Why does
We lost you again.
We lost your voice, Mark.
Why does Iran need a nuclear peaceful program? It doesn't. In fact, experts in energy think that the way Iran should go is to develop better its energy resources. It is rich in energy resources. And the next point is about reforming Iran. Iran is a country which has violated human rights. And what an ire, the Passage militia coming on the streets and beating the people. But here's the great irony. Iran is a member of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. I rest my case. I'm a lawyer, QED. In other words, if the point of all this was to bring, this was Obama's idea, as you said, Paolo, very, very well, to bring Iran in, to try to work up arrangements with them, to work with them, which would be great for the world, for the region. Those efforts have failed. In all three administrations, we haven't gotten there. We made a deal, didn't really work. He pulled out of the deal, Trump did, it doesn't work. Biden wants to make a deal, but just do it on this compliance for the compliance, it doesn't work. The problem is that in no way, and I think this is true, I've never heard, have you, from Iran, that they've ever moderated? No, they elected Raisi, who is a hardliner. Okay, so the point is, if someone's anti-American, okay, they're entitled to be anti-American, but sit down, negotiate, work out a fair deal, but don't come with preconditions and say, I'm not going to meet with you in the room, and you've got to remove the sanctions first, and you've got to take the IRGC off the list. All these things show me, as I'm a lawyer also, so I'm listening to the other guy on the table is making these points. I'm understanding that what's the real objective? What is the real objective here? Is the objective to work out a peaceful future? Or is the objective to be able to keep the situation stabilized so that there can be, and you said trajectory, which was a good one, to have a trajectory to a very violent future where Iran continues to do what it's doing. So my point is, it's great to make deals, but again, I would go back to Russia. You know, it's a funny thing, right? Ukraine had the Budapest Memorandum, a guarantee from Russia that if it gave up its nuclear weapons, Russia would guarantee its territorial integrity. I think the whole premise of international agreements, international negotiations, we have to sit back and think about what happens in the world if this goes south for whatever reason, and how do we deal with a nuclear Iran? This is such a frightening prospect. And sit around at that point and point fingers, Trump did it, this one did it, this one did it, is not going to get us to a peaceful future.
I get that. And there's a couple of questions from the audience directed at you,
yes.
Barbara, but just allow me again to say the obvious, which I am not an expert and I don't claim to be so knowledgeable as either of you are on these complicated matters. But at the time of the Obama administration, when the original deal was struck and people would say, well, it doesn't do this and doesn't do that, et cetera, et cetera. And my question to my people I was talking to is, if this is a bad deal, show me a better deal. Show me a better one that the Iranians would sign and that you could make them sign. That didn't exist. Mr. Trump came along with the idea, we're going to squeeze the Iranians so much that we will force them to come to the table and do the right thing. That didn't happen. Now we're trying to restart something. And yes, it's not perfect, but if we don't do anything and Iran is loose and does its own thing and continues to, progressively enrich uranium and do other stuff, is that better? That's my question. I don't, honestly, I don't profess enough knowledge about any of this. But I think, it's a really, as I see it, very complicated. But Barbara, something to you. There's a gentleman here who is taking it from a different angle, and as saying, and I quote, was the Abraham Accord undone by the Biden administration? Which I'm not sure that it was undone, but anyway, that's the claim. Was the Abraham Accord undone by the Biden administration as stabilizing or destabilizing control on Iranian nuclear ambitions? That's question number one. But again, still, same gentleman directing to you. And here we're hearing something that we already discussed. But basically, the country that continues to chant death to America and death to Israel, is that the country we really want to do business with? I'm paraphrasing the question.
All right.
So how does one negotiate a deal based on trust with an untrustworthy government? I mean, you heard this many times before, I'm sure. So Abraham Accord undone, question mark, does it do anything?
Secretary of State Tony Blinken just participated in a big meeting with foreign ministers from all the parties to the Abraham Accords, and the Biden administration is trying to build on it. In fact, it's one of the few things Trump did that actually got bipartisan support in the United States. So that's not the case at all. Whether it's had any impact on Iran and its strategy, if anything, I think it may have caused Iran to be a little bit more aggressive because Iran sees it as an anti-Iran alliance, for better or worse. But these countries have a variety of reasons for wanting to recognize each other and trade with each other. And I think overall it's a good thing. And the more Arab countries recognize Israel, the more it may finally dawn on the Iranians that their policy toward Israel is really unrealistic and counterproductive. One other thing, you negotiate with your enemies. You don't negotiate with your friends. I mean, Richard Armitage, a former Deputy Secretary of State, had a great line, which I quoted in my book, about how diplomacy is the art of having the other guy have your way. So it's the only way you can influence people is to negotiate with them, and you need to negotiate with your adversaries. Most of all, the Iranians are not irrational. This regime would not be in power for 40 years if it was irrational. If anything, it's rather coldly calculating. And you know, we have to try. That's all we can possibly do. One last point, by the way, you know, yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric, death to Israel, blah, blah, blah. Israel has at least 90 nuclear weapons, according to the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. At least 90 nuclear weapons. Israel could destroy Iran. Iran cannot destroy Israel.
Well, Mark, we're getting, by the way, as a timekeeper, we're getting to the end of the time allocated to us. So maybe it's time for closing statements, if we can.
Can I just comment on the Abraham Accords very quickly for 10 seconds? The whole point of the Abraham Accords, and what's the glue that keeps it together, is that these states, these regional powers, are afraid of Iran. Now, they live there. I'm living in Manhattan. I don't live in the region, but the people who live there look at Iran with fear and trepidation based on all the things they've done in Yemen and Syria and throughout the world and in the region. So I would give them a lot of credence for what they're saying. Now, as far as the Iranians, I think they were a party to the Non-Proliferation Agreement, you know, the treaty. So, you know, can they be trusted to follow all of these agreements? Well, I don't think they have a good track record. And I'm very sorry to say that as an American, I cannot forget the hostage taking in 1979. I think that was one of the greatest outrages ever committed in world history and against the United States of America, to kidnap people and hold them and ruin their lives. And then at this point, those people have been forgotten as well. So, you know, we shouldn't forget that there's a track record here, and it's one that's very problematic. And it's true, Barbara's right. You do deal with all your close friends. We deal with Europeans, our allies, yes. You deal with your enemies, of course, but you don't deal with your adversaries from a position of weakness. And that was the problem with this deal from the outset. Now, maybe Trump was wrong to pull out of it. Maybe Trump should have come up with something different. But the bottom line is we need to find a way forward to stop the other things that Iran is involved in and get the region back into stability. And I think that is a good objective. And, you know, I'm very worried about the future, by the way.
Yeah, my personal comment, and here I am just as a member of the audience here, I'm listening to you. All these things are highly desirable. You know, I don't see a roadmap to getting them. I mean, it is highly desirable. I don't know. Sorry if I extrapolate, to stop global warming. I don't know that we have all the tools that is necessary to achieve it. I know it's nothing to do with anything, but let me throw it there just for color. So yes, all these are desirable objectives. Make Iranians responsible. Stop this. Don't do that, etc. Create better rules of engagement with everybody. Normalize relations. And maybe every morning I take the bus down Massachusetts Avenue, and it goes by the former chancery, right, of the Iranian embassy, and I said, oh boy, it's been closed a long time. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll reopen, right? We can be surprised, but I'm not sure that I'm not holding my breath. Okay, but would that be desirable to do so under good auspices? Absolutely. Barbara, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, stability in the Middle East, I've not seen it in my lifetime. I've been around a long time. It's not a region that's prone to stability. You have a lot of horrible autocratic regimes with human rights records that are as bad or worse than Iran's. Saudi Arabia, chopping up journalists and throwing critics in prison and stealing their money. Boycotting other countries. There are no paragons of virtue in this part of the world. And Israel is also, unfortunately, going through another tough spell, has not resolved its problems with the Palestinians, and it really has to someday. So, I think we have to make an effort. Obviously, if the Iranians continue to bring up issues like the IRGC and whatnot, and to show that they're not really motivated to return to the agreement, we're going to drop it at some point. But we'll have to come back and try something else, because this is a country of 80 million people in a pivotal part of the world, and it cannot be walled off. It's not North Korea. It's not Cuba. And we will have to deal with it. One concern I have is that we're creating a coalition of the sanction by throwing Russia, China, Iran all together, and that's not a good thing either. One last disagreement with Mark. I don't think Obama was operating from weakness. The sanctions regime was multilateral, supported by the United Nations when we were negotiating with Iran under Obama. Now they're unilateral, and I think we're much weaker as a result.
On this note, I really thank both of you. This is a spirited discussion, which is what we like, and so to hear different positions and different angles debated. I thank our audience as well, that so that you had a chance to be enlightened. I learned new things, and who knows, what's going to happen with these current negotiations, if we will see some light at the proverbial end of the tunnel. So on behalf of Bay Atlantic University and the Global Policy Institute, I thank all of you. I thank our guests. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Mark. And to be continued. Maybe we'll have a chance to revisit all this sooner than we think, maybe with good news. Who knows? Let's be hopeful. Thanks to everybody. And by the way, once again, to my good friend and colleague, Denise Caritas, who has organized, all the logistics and everything behind the scenes for this event. Thank you, Denise. And thanks to everybody. Goodbye, Mark. Goodbye, Barbara. Thank you.
Thanks.
Come on.